Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to another version of the B&H Virtual Event Space. You are tuned into Intro to Photography, part one of four cameras and lenses, of course, hosted by Sony. And for that, I'd like to welcome Sony Artisan of Imagery, Tony Gale. Tony, how's it going?
It's going very well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. Good to have you back as always. And
Thank
as
you.
you know, and as some of our viewers might know, or many of them, we do this Intro to Photography four-part series a couple times a year. Tony always provides some relevant updates based on what's going on in the world of photography and gear and the like. So I'm going to turn it over to Tony. He does it best. You guys, if you do have any questions, feel free to get them into the comments section, and I will turn it over to you, Tony.
Thank you very much. See you at the end. Hi, everybody. I am Tony Gale. I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery. And this is Photo 101, Intro to Photography, part one of six. We've added, in the past, I've done 4 parts. This time we're doing 6. This is camera and lenses. Thanks, as always, to Sony for having me in the B&H Event Space. Without them, I'm just sitting at home, twiddling my thumbs. In addition to being a Sony Artisan of Imagery, I'm also a BenQ ambassador, a Manfrotto ambassador, and an X-Rite Colorati, just in case any of those brands come up. And coming up with me and B&H and Sony, we have a fall foliage photo walk in Central Park this Wednesday. We have part 2 of this series, November 13th. We have part 3 of the series, November 27th. We're also going to have part 4, Intro to Lighting, part 5, post-production, part 6, finding your specialty. We just haven't picked dates for those, but December to January. So if this is helpful, or if you're more interested in one of those or all of them, take a look. It's certainly worth the price. It's hard to beat free. Also, aside from me doing stuff with Sony and B&H, there's a ton of really great content sponsored by Sony coming up with the B&H Event Space over the next couple of months. You can always just go to the B&H Event Space website to take a look. I did a little screenshot to give you everything. Beauty of Travel series, street photography, landscape photography, holiday family photos, Sony buying guide, where the rubber meets the road, the selection appointment, Zen and the Art of Seeing, all sorts of cool stuff. So take a look. They're all free. How can you go wrong? Also, coming up in just a couple of weeks here in New York City, Sony is doing their Creative Space event. It's a free event. You can register if you go to alphauniverse.com and then go to events and Creative Space. If you're going to be in New York on November 8th and 9th, take a look, register. There's going to be shooting sets, photo walks. You can try out Sony gear. It's free. It's always a very cool event. They did one last year. They did one in San Francisco a month or 2 ago. It's worth checking out. Additionally, Sony Alpha Universe forums, I've mentioned that before, also at alphauniverse.com. If you click on community and then forums, if you have questions about photography, it doesn't have to be Sony specific. You could just have a question about anything. If you ask a question about a different brand of camera, maybe no one knows the answer. But if you just want to interact with people, share some work, and ask some questions, anything like that, it's a very welcoming community. Like I said, on alphauniverse.com. Also, the Sony Alpha Female Facebook group does a $500 micro grant every week based on a different topic. You submit a picture, somebody judges, and one person gets $500. It's free to enter. You do not have to identify as female to enter, but you do have to be a nice person. That's not actually in the rules. I just am saying that. So Sony Alpha Female Facebook group, also a very welcoming group. Feel free to take a look at that. And I just wanted to mention, because I think it's cool, Sony a couple months ago just announced the Sony Alpha 7 C2. I have the C1. It's a very portable full-frame camera. I like it a lot. And I have ordered, but it has not yet arrived, I'm sure any day now, the Sony Alpha 7 CR. Very small, portable, full-frame camera. They're really, really cool. Also, because people always ask what deals and specials there are, alphauniverse.com has that under, they have a tab for specials, but so does B&H. So if you want to do a search on B&H, you can say you're looking at Sony mirrorless cameras, and then if you look in the upper right there where it says filter by, you can select deals and rebates, and things that are on sale, that come with free stuff, that have rebates, that stuff will all pop up. So if you're shopping for new things, it's worth a look. All right, all of that out of the way. I am a commercial photographer, primarily people and portraits. I've been doing it for a long time. I started photo assisting in 1997. So that's 26 years. Somewhere in there, I stopped assisting and became a photographer. I've been doing it a long time. When I started, cameras used film. I know people still like film. I haven't shot film in years. So things have changed a lot, and things change feels like almost every day. The technology changes, what's available changes. So to start with, we're going to go over cameras and lenses. And part of the reason for that is it's not uncommon for someone to come up and say, what camera should I buy? What lens should I buy? I have this camera, what lens should I buy? Those are not simple questions to answer because they're so subjective and based on everybody and what they're looking for, what they hope to accomplish, budget, and all this stuff. So we're going to go over the ins and outs of understanding different types of cameras, different types of lenses, why something might cost more, why something might cost less. The more expensive camera might be the answer, but the less expensive camera might be the answer. There are a lot of options out there, and there are different things that are appropriate for different people. There is no one size fits all that's right for everybody. So what camera should I buy? There's a lot of cameras, like I said, $6,400, $900, Alpha 7C2, $2,500, 6,700 with the 18 to 135, $1,800, a ZV1, $750. There's a lot of different things. It's hard to just look and know. Also, these screenshots should all be current. I just made them in the last couple of days, but prices change constantly. So I know a lot of people watch this in the future. Hello from the past. These prices may or may not be what's available whenever you have them. So the answer, like I said, for which camera you should buy is it depends. It depends on if you want small, big, what your budget is, what you want to shoot, all that kind of thing. There's a ton of options. Point and shoots, bridge cameras, interchangeable lens cameras, maybe your phone. The Sony Xperia phones are really good for photography. Is it going to replace my mirrorless cameras? No, but it's always with me and it does a good job. So let's talk about the different types of cameras in a simplified way. By its very nature, and because it's such a deep thing, there would be without question things that I skip over or omit. And I'm a Sony artisan. Sony is sponsoring this talk. So the cameras I'm talking about are Sony. If you shoot with another brand, a lot of the same things should apply. You know, a phone is a phone, a point and shoot's a point and shoot, a bridge camera, specialty camera, mirrorless camera. All that terminology is the same regardless of brand. So this should still be useful regardless of what brand you shoot with. But Sony's what I know, and Sony's what I'm talking about, and Sony's what I like. So in broad strokes, you have your phone as a camera, you have point and shoot cameras, you have bridge cameras, you have specialty cameras, you have a DSLR or SLT interchangeable lens camera, and you have a mirrorless camera, interchangeable lens camera. So to start with your phone, I'm sure everybody watching has a phone. I use the Sony Xperia Pro I because it has a 1-inch sensor, and because the Sony Xperia camera phones have an app that will let me shoot RAW and change the ISO, change the shutter speed, all sorts of cool stuff. It mimics in a lot of ways what the Alpha cameras do. So that's what I use. It has 3 different lenses, 16mm equivalent, 24mm equivalent, 50mm equivalent. I did these this morning as I waited for the subway in Brooklyn. Not my best photos ever, but you get the point. So the phone, you always have it with you. I sometimes see people apologize for using their phones when they come on a photo walk. Don't apologize for using your phone. If that's working for you, great. You may get to a point where something else will work better, and that's great too. But if you're taking pictures, you're taking pictures. The tools you use will allow you to take different pictures, hopefully better pictures, more pictures, create things that maybe you couldn't with something else. but don't feel bad about what you're using. All right, so we have phones. Everybody's got that. We have the point and shoot cameras. There aren't a lot of point and shoots the way there used to be, because a lot of people use their phones instead. I have the Sony RX100 Mark VI, which is a great point and shoot, 1-inch sensor, 24 to 200 millimeter equivalent lens. No phone is going to do that. Can shoot full RAW, pop-up flash, all that stuff. There's also things like the Sony CyberShot HX99, not a camera, to be honest, that I'm familiar with at all, but it's relatively inexpensive. Point and shoots are great. My RX100 is in my pocket almost all the time. But you're probably looking for something else. There are things, like I said, the RX100 6 and 7 have a 24 millimeter to 200 equivalent. This is what that means in real terms, and we'll talk about focal length and all of that in a little bit. This is from the roof of where I live in Brooklyn. 24 millimeters on the left, so wide angle, 200 millimeters on the right, so telephoto. It's a pretty incredible zoom on a camera that's this big. Then you have bridge cameras. Bridge cameras are sort of the link between something like a point and shoot and a bigger removable lens camera. I know people, for example, who love the RX10 Mark IV. This has a 200 to 600 equivalent, which is absolutely incredible. For some people, this is all the camera they will ever need. A while back, I was in B&H, and I overheard somebody talking about how they were going on an Alaskan cruise and trying to figure out what camera to get, and I recommended this because 24 millimeters, you can get the wide angle, you know, the glaciers from the ship. 600 millimeters, if you see a whale or a bear on the shore, you've got a pretty good shot at it, all in one portable camera. It's a 1-inch sensor. You can't switch out the lenses, so it's not without its limitations, but it is a great bridge camera. Then you have things, specialty cameras. You have things like the Sony RX0 Mark II, which is a little tiny 1-inch sensor camera. I keep saying 1-inch sensor. I'll explain that in a bit. Fixed 35 millimeter equivalent or 24 millimeter equivalent lens, shockproof, drop proof. It's like an action camera in many ways, but it's not the same. It can do 4K video, really excellent. They sometimes use these in movies for crash cams. You know, maybe you put it on a camera that's gonna, or on a car that's gonna crash into something, and you can use the footage off that because you don't want to put your $100,000 cinema camera on. There's also things like video cameras. I'm not really going to talk about those today, except to acknowledge that they're there. You have things like the Sony Venice, which is like the new Avatar movie was largely or all shot on Sony Venice. It's a cinema camera, 8K, absolutely incredible. And you're going to be looking at many tens of thousands of dollars to get into it. If you're someone who's shooting enough video that you're considering a Venice, you already know about it and you're not watching this video. If you're just dabbling in video and you want something that's a little more video specific as opposed to still specific, there are things like the FX30. There's your classic camcorders. All that stuff still exists. But every mirrorless camera from Sony, certainly, and I assume everyone else, but you know, I can't say for sure, will also shoot video. And so for most of us that want to shoot stills and video, I think a traditional mirrorless camera is the way to go. There's also DSLR. Oh, I misspelled DSLR. That should not be LSR. DSLRs, Sony, the more recent DSLRs were SLTs, which had a fixed pellicle mirror, so the mirror didn't flip up, so that wasn't a reflex, it was a fixed lens. Sony is really all in on mirrorless now, so you can find like a used Alpha 99, which was a great camera, Alpha 99 Mark II, Alpha 77 Mark II. They were great cameras, but the technology has advanced so much with mirrorless cameras, even to the point where some of the other brands that were late to the mirrorless game have said that they've basically stopped development on non-mirrorless cameras. All the technology is going mirrorless. Even if you don't want to buy a Sony camera, but you're looking at a new camera, I would really, really, really encourage you to buy a mirrorless camera. Obviously, I think for most people, Sony is the best option. But whatever it is that you buy, if you buy a DSLR, you're buying something that's sort of end of life. They're not going to do new versions of that camera. They're probably not going to develop new lenses. And a lot of the features of that camera will not be as good as what's available for mirrorless. Then we have mirrorless cameras. So the difference between a mirrorless camera and something like a DSLR in the broadest strokes is there's no mirror. So a DSLR, like I said, there's a mirror. You look through the prism, down, there's a mirror, it flaps up when you take a picture. With the Sony SLT cameras, it doesn't flap up. The light goes through it because it's translucent. But there's a prism, all of that. Mirrorless cameras got rid of that. Sony introduced their first mirrorless camera, the Alpha 7 and the Alpha 7R, about 10 years ago. And now, I mean, the technology has just gone bananas since then. It's absolutely incredible what we can do with mirrorless cameras now. As I've said many times, we're in a fortunate time to be doing photography because we can do things that just weren't possible. Aside from the things that were really, really, really difficult before, there are things that you just couldn't do before. The fastest film that was available when I was starting out was 3200 speed black and white. Something like the Alpha 7S3 will go up to 400,000 ISO. Now, 400,000 ISO is going to be noisy, sure, but you can still get a picture. If you needed that much film speed when it was all film, it just didn't happen. It was impossible. We're really, really, really lucky to have what's available to us. It's absolutely incredible. So with mirrorless cameras, you've got APS-C on the left, something like the Sony Alpha 6100, which is the entry-level APS-C camera. Something like the Alpha 7R5 on the right, which is a 61 megapixel full frame camera. There's a lot of options out there. So all that said, we talked about cameras a little bit. What kind of photos do you want to take? You know, you're trying to decide what camera to buy. Different cameras are ideal for different purposes. So you have to think about what you want to photograph: sports, portraits, street, travel, architecture, animals, events. I think a lot of us, when we're starting out, want to do a little bit of everything. There's a reason that later on part of this series is thinking about what your specialty might be. It's in part because everyone I know, including myself, resisted finding a specialty. And you don't have to. Anything I say or anyone else says, especially if you don't want to be a commercial photographer, a professional photographer, you can do what you want. You know, you have agency, you have freedom of choice. If you want to do a little bit of everything, you can. Part of the reason to find a specialty is it allows you to get much better at that thing. It's really hard to be really, really, really good at all of these things. I'm not saying you can't do it, but it's a challenge. So let's say you want to shoot sports. So sports, fast moving, thing you're photographing is fast moving. You might want a high frame rate. You know, this was done with the Alpha 6400, which does 11 frames a second. He was doing jumping push-ups. So one of the key things for something like sports, this is also applies to things like birds in flight, things like that. Anything that moves quickly is your frame rate. So your frame rate is how many frames per second you can take a full resolution photo. There are cameras that will do higher frame rates, but at much lower than full resolution. To me, that's a little less useful. And at that point, you might as well just shoot video and do frame grabs. For example, I could do 120 frames a second, 4K. Sony Alpha 1, it's not going to be the full 50 megapixels that I can do 30 frames a second, but if I need it, it's there. The max frame rate is, however, like I said, I think the most useful when it's full resolution. So the Alpha 1, 50 megapixels, 30 frames a second in high plus. So this was photographed at 30 frames a second. You can see, as the cyclists go by, how many variations on it there are. And if you look, for example, I think there's a handful of frames in the second from the bottom row that are the best frames. Like with the two guys in there, maybe that third from the left, third from the top picture. But the advantage of that 30 frames a second is it gives you a lot of options. It's really hard if you're photographing a football game, for example, and you're trying to get that touchdown pass. to time that just right is really, really hard. Now, some of the greatest sports photos ever taken were taken on film cameras without motor drives and without autofocus. But it took years to learn how to do that. And all of those guys and women missed a lot of photos. Here, with autofocus, it's going to nail the focus. And at 30 frames a second, you've got a really good shot at getting that winning image. So 30 frames a second. Here's the same camera, Alpha 1, at 15 frames a second. So half the number of frames per second. And you can see there's fewer good options, and there's just fewer options to choose from. Then you go down to something like 5 frames a second. Hardly any good options. So frame rate, that's important if you want to shoot things that are fast moving. Something like the Alpha 1, 30 frames a second in electronic shutter. The Alpha 9 II, 20 frames a second in electronic shutter. Something like the Alpha 7R5 or the Alpha 7 IV is 10 frames a second at the fastest, which is still fast. 20 years ago, people would have been over the moon to have cameras that did 10 frames a second. Most cameras couldn't do anything approaching that, and partly that's because they were limited by the mirror flapping up and down, the time it took to do that. But think about that. Also, something like the Alpha 6700, the 6400 can do 11 frames a second, even though they're less expensive cameras, in part because they're smaller and the sensor is smaller. So the Blue Angels a couple of years ago, fast moving. Maybe you're going to photograph something that's not fast moving, like a lighthouse, landscapes, Little Red Lighthouse, Arches National Park, which, oh, I forget which one that is. You know, maybe you're going to do some street photography. Then you've got a lot more options. So something like the Alpha 1 or the Alpha 9 II will work great for that. But so will almost anything. Then you want to think about resolution. So resolution is how much information there is in the file. Alpha 7R5, 61 megapixels, as is the 4. The 3 and the 2 and the 1 were smaller. 61 megapixels is a big file. A lot of people are concerned about the hard drive space. I just have a lot of hard drives. Hard drives aren't cheap or aren't expensive anymore. The advantage of that high resolution is that you can crop. So if I'm photographing, say, a bird, and it's only a small part of the frame, I can crop it and still have a lot of information. Something like the Alpha 7 IV, which is, I think, 30 megapixels, 31 megapixels, is great. Less resolution, so you can't crop as much. Something like the Alpha 7 III, 12 megapixels, can't crop as much. If you're not going to crop, that becomes less of an issue. If you're only going to put it on Instagram, less of an issue. So you're looking at cameras and you're trying to figure out what you want and trying to understand what all these differences are. One of the things you can do is go onto B&H, go to a camera and click specs, and it will tell you all the information. So we're just going to go through. I picked the Alpha 1, which is the highest end Sony mirrorless camera, and the Alpha 6100, which is the intro level mirrorless camera. Lens mount, Sony E, that's the same for both. Sensor resolution, 50 megapixels, 24.2 megapixels. Image size, full frame versus APS-C. It tells you if it has image stabilization or not. So the Alpha 1 has in-body image stabilization, which allows you to hand hold at a slower shutter speed and still get it sharp. The 6100 does not have image stabilization, but many lenses do. Tells you the ISO range, the continuous shooting range, so 30 frames, 11 frames, the video recording, 8K, 4K, 422, 10-bit, what memory media it takes. So they both take SD cards, but the Alpha 1 also takes Compact Flash Express Type A, size of the HDMI port. There's a lot of information, the batteries, all of that. So always take a look at that and make sure that it's going to do what you want. So one thing, for example, is the Alpha 1, 8,000th of a second is its maximum mechanical shutter speed. 32,000th is its maximum electronic shutter speed. With the Alpha 6100, 4,000th of a second is its maximum shutter speed. Lots and lots of stuff, ISO, exposure range, all of that. So whatever camera you're looking at, Alpha 7 IV on the left, Alpha 7 R5 on the right, same thing. Always just take a look, make sure that you understand what it is you're looking at. And one thing, if you live in New York, that I often recommend that people do if they're looking at a camera, go into B&H, go to the counter, get your hands on it, see how it feels, ask questions. They have almost everything on the floor, so you can take a look and see. If you're not in New York, that makes it harder. So let's talk about sensor types. I'm talking about this only really for informational purposes. At this point, almost nothing is CCD, pretty much. CCD was the original digital camera technology, standard CMOS. Stack CMOS and back illuminated CMOS is what almost everything is now. Backside illuminated CMOS allows for more of the wiring of the CMOS to be on the back of the sensor, and it makes it more sensitive to light, so it should be less noisy. Almost everything is going to be CMOS, one of those CMOS things now. If you see something that's CCD, it's old. Don't buy it. All right, I mentioned 1-inch sensors a lot. I mentioned full frame. I mentioned APS-C. What that is the size of the area that is exposed to light that gives you information. So full frame is based off of what 35 millimeter film was or is. It's 24 by 36 millimeter frame. This is the relative size. So full frame is on the outside. That's 24 by 36 millimeters. APS-C is in the middle. And APS was the advanced photo system. It was a system developed, I think, late 90s, early 2000s by a bunch of camera manufacturers that gave you different sizes of film. So there was APS-C, there was APS-H. I think there was a third one. But you can see full frame, quite a bit larger than APS-C. 1-inch sensor, not as big as APS-C, still good size. Then you have typically on point and shoots and on phones, you have 2/3 sensors and 1/2.5 sensors. Those get progressively smaller. So the reason that this matters is, all things being equal, you should get a cleaner image from a larger sensor. There's more information there. The pixels don't have to be squeezed in so tight if everything else is the same. So say a 60 megapixel full frame sensor should be, if it's all current and modern, better than an APS-C 60 megapixel, which should be better than a 1-inch 60 megapixel, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of things that come into play with that, and it doesn't mean that an APS-C or 1-inch or whatever sensor isn't good. You know, sometimes it's shades of gray. I can tell you that almost exclusively I shoot full frame. Because it gives me the highest resolution and, in theory, the cleanest images, but again, it depends. It also depends on the age of the camera. You know, I imagine, although I can't say for sure, and I'm sure that there will be people who will be screaming at their computers as I say some of these things. I would think that a full frame camera from 10 years ago is probably not as good as any modern APS-C camera that's made today in terms of image quality. I can't say that for sure. I've never tested it. I'm just speculating, but that would be my guess. So when we talk about image size, APS-C, full frame, 1-inch, that's what we're talking about. It's the size of the sensor on the camera, or the usable part of the sensor. Like I said, 2/3 and 1/2.5, and there's some others, don't come into play much because they're for very, very small things. So let's talk about resolution. I mentioned higher resolution gives you more ability to crop. So this is a view up 7th Avenue at 12.4 megapixels, 21 megapixels, forgive the shadow difference, and 50 megapixels, and 200 megapixels. The 200 megapixels is from using a feature called pixel shift, which I quite like, that takes multiple images and stitches them together in software with certain Sony cameras. The Alpha 7R3, 4, and 5, and the Alpha 1 all have pixel shift. It's a very cool feature. But it allowed me to take a 50 megapixel camera and get a 200 megapixel image. So 12, I just didn't brighten up the shadows. My apologies. 21, 50, 200. With the exception of the exposure differences and the shadow differences, you probably can't tell an image quality difference because they're all still pretty small on your screen. But this gives you a sense of the actual size difference. So 12.4 megapixels, 21, 50, 200. This is the relative difference in size. And if you look at cropping, this is the 200 millimeter or 200 megapixel cropped tightly. It still looks good. You can't do that. You can't do a crop that tight. You can see it there in the middle. And still have it as clean with a smaller resolution. It's just going to break up. All right. So that's resolution, that's sensor size, that's sensor types. Let's talk about lenses. So APS-C versus full frame lenses, focal length, zoom versus prime, autofocus versus manual focus, G Master G, Sony's Eyes, Sony, and adapted. With a couple of these, I'm just going to say autofocus versus manual focus. Unless you have a really compelling reason, just buy an autofocus. I don't think Sony doesn't make any manual focus lenses. There are third parties that do. Unless you are really dedicated to always doing manual focus, I think you're going to miss not having autofocus if you buy a manual focus lens. I have some old adapted ones that I got just because it's fun to have old adapted lenses. They're manual focus only. But other than that, you can always put an autofocus lens on manual focus, but just stick with that. So let's start with focal lengths. So the focal length of a lens is measured in millimeters. This is one thing that's going to get a little confusing is if you're using anything smaller than APS-C, most likely that lens is using full frame equivalents, meaning it's not the actual millimeters, it's what it would be if it was full frame. So the 24 to 200 on the RX100 6 and 7 is not actually 200 millimeters. It's less, but because the sensor is smaller, it becomes the equivalent to that. So on APS-C and full frame, which are the only ones that you're going to be buying lenses for, it's an actual scientific thing. So a 200 millimeter lens is based on the ratio of different things. And it's the same if it's APS-C or full frame. However, because an APS-C sensor is smaller, a 200 millimeter lens on APS-C effectively becomes longer and becomes effectively a 300 millimeter lens because what it's essentially doing is cropping into the middle. We'll go over it a little. This is 12 millimeters to 1200 millimeters on full frame, again from the roof in Brooklyn. 12 millimeters with the 12 to 24 on the left, 1200 millimeters with the 200 to 600 and a 2x extender on the right. You can see it's a little squishy on the right. That's mostly because it was, I took this in the summer, and so you're getting the heat waves and the atmospheric distortion, which makes sense when you consider that I live about 8 miles from the Empire State Building in Brooklyn. And yet I was able to get this close with 1200 millimeters. So if you want reach, either one can work. However, 12 millimeters to 1200 millimeters on APS-C, because the APS-C sensor is smaller, everything effectively becomes longer. So 1200 millimeters is equivalent, roughly, to 800 millimeters on full frame. However, 12 millimeters, the wide, is equivalent to 18 millimeters. So if you want to shoot grand landscapes that are super wide, APS-C is going to be harder to do that with. If you want to shoot things that are very far away, APS-C might be easier to do that with. So 12 millimeters on the left, 1200 on the right on APS-C. On full frame, you can see the difference there. You also have the factor with focal length of compression. So 12 millimeters on the left and 105 on the right. In general, people talk about portrait lenses being 70 to 135-ish. Partly this is why. You can take a portrait with any lens. It's still a portrait, but it will distort because the field of view is so wide. So this is my my friend Michel Leroy, another very good photographer, was kind enough to stand in for me on the, so 12 millimeters on the left, 105 millimeters on the right on full frame. 12 millimeters upper left, then down to 18, 24, 35. You can see 12, 18, 24, 24 starting to look normal, 35, 50, 70 is looking better, 105, 135, 200, 300, 400. You can see how the shape of his face changes, becomes more flattering, I think. And also, because the field of view is narrower, the depth of field becomes shallower. And what that means is that the background becomes more out of focus, which is often more flattering for portraits. So I'm not in the same position in each of these because as I used a longer lens, I had to step back. But his head is roughly the same size in each one. So the 12 millimeter, I'm right on top of him. Back, 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 back. 400, I'm probably 20 feet away. 200 millimeters on the left, 12 millimeters on the right. You also have the field of view. So aside from how it may feel with a person, I tried to do a similar thing here where I kept the orange pylon thing, this roughly the same size. And if you look at 200 millimeters, it's there in the middle. You see a little bit of the pizza sign. You see a little, the building it's in front of. As you go to a wider lens, even though it stays a similar size, you get a lot more information in the background. So a common thing that people like to say is zoom with your feet. Some photographer, I forget who, used to say all you need is a 50 millimeter lens. That's true to a point. Like if you're not close enough, you can usually walk closer. That's what zooming with your feet means, but it's not the same effect. Walking up with the 12 millimeter, even though the pylon is a similar size to the 200 millimeter, it's not the same picture. So zooming with your feet, it's a nice turn of phrase, but it's limited. 1224 f4G at 12 millimeters. One of my favorite lenses. 100 to 400 at 400 millimeters. 2470 GM at 24, exact same spot at 70. All right, we talked about the crop factor, right? That on full frame versus APS-C, the same lens is showing more or less information. So we have 400 millimeter APS-C on the right, 586 millimeters. I wasn't able to get quite 600 because it's a zoom. On the left, to get a similar size, 400 millimeter, or I'm sorry, APS-C gives you more reach, less width. Here we are again, the same pictures as before, 12 and 12, 1200 and 1200. You want to go to the baseball game, APS-C, like the 6300 may be the answer. I mentioned phones and point and shoot cameras use full frame equivalents on lens notation usually. So whatever it says is just to make it easier to understand, because if it says 6 millimeters, it's hard to actually understand what that means. So you're looking at APS-C lenses, you're looking at full frame lenses, you're wondering, can I use APS-C lenses on full frame cameras? You can always, you should be able to put a full frame lens on an APS-C camera with no problems. There are people who believe that it would be better to put an APS-C camera on an APS-C, or an APS-C lens on an APS-C camera, and you'll get better image quality. I haven't experienced that. And in general, if the lens is iffy on image quality, the center is usually sharper, which is what the APS-C camera is going to see. You can put most APS-C lenses on a full frame body and it will work, but with caveats. So I have a Sony 10-18 APS-C lens on a full frame camera. If you have a Sony camera right out of the box, if you put an APS-C lens on it, it's automatically going to crop. So I sometimes see people who are using APS-C lenses and think it works and not knowing why things aren't quite right. The camera's automatically cropping because of this vignetting. An APS-C lens just doesn't expose the whole image area. You can see the dark edges at the corner on the left. The 10-18 is known for being almost enough, but not quite. So left is with the crop turned off, right is with the crop on. At 10 millimeters, you can see there's a lot of vignetting. So the usable frame is just not the same. The 16-50, huge amount of vignetting with the crop turned off. So yes, you can put APS-C lenses on full frame cameras. Just be aware that what you're getting is not the full frame. I would encourage anyone who's looking at getting into a new system, if you think at some point you're going to shoot full frame, even if you're buying APS-C now, I would buy full frame lenses. If you think you're only going to ever use APS-C, different story. But if you're someone who's like, right now I'm going to buy the Alpha 6100 or 6400, and in a couple of years I'll buy the Alpha 1 or the Alpha 7R5, rather than investing in APS-C lenses and then having to replace them, I would just buy full frame lenses. So zooms versus primes. Nice big zoom. That's 12 to 1200 in one quick zoom. Zooms give you multiple focal lengths in one lens. So for example, the 24-105 f4 lens, a lens I have and really like, 24-105 in one lens, it's $1,300. It gives you the same equivalent focal lengths as the 24, the 28, the 35, the 40, the 50, the 85, the 90, and the 100, but all in one lens, and certainly cheaper than buying all of those lenses. So why wouldn't you only buy zooms? You might. You might be someone that should only buy zooms. I know people who only buy zooms. It just depends on what you need. There are things that fixed lenses are better at. Typically, for example, maximum aperture can be much lower on a fixed lens. So the 24-14 GM is f1.4. We're going to talk more about what that means in the next part of this. That 1.4 is 1.4 to 2 is 1 stops, to 2.8 is 3 stops, to 1 is 2 stops, 2.8 to 4 is 3 stops. So it's 3 stops faster than the 24-105, which means that you can have 3 times as fast as shutter speed if you needed it. What you need just depends. There is no one right answer. I will tell you, I have the 24-105. I also have the 24, the 35, the 40, the 51.2. I have the 85-1.8. I have the 90, and I have the 100. So I have almost all of these lenses because I use them for different things. Then we have, as I mentioned, autofocus versus manual focus. Just buy autofocus. Lens types and differences. So if you're looking at Sony lenses, you may see an A lens, an E lens, and an FE lens. A is Sony A mount, which is their DSLRs and their SLT cameras. If you have a Sony mirrorless camera, you can buy an adapter for A mount, but I would encourage you to buy E or FE lenses. E is all Sony mirrorless cameras are E mount. FE is full frame E mount. So if the lens only says E, it's APS-C. If it says FE, it's full frame E. Then you may see Sony G Master, Sony G, Sony Zeiss, and Sony. Sony G Master is their top end pro. It's better weather sealed. Typically the autofocus is better. It may be sharper. The coatings are better. The build quality is higher. All of that. But you're going to pay more for that. That's the top end pro. You have Sony G and Sony Zeiss, which are excellent lenses. They're professional lenses. They used to be the top end before G Master came out. And part of the point of G Master is to be good enough that as newer cameras come out with more resolving power, they're still, the Sony G Master lenses still will be just as good on those higher resolution cameras. And then you have Sony lenses, which are not as weather sealed, but can still be excellent. For example, the Sony 85-1.8, about $600. Don't quote me on prices. I think it's one of the best lenses for the money that's made. For a lot of people, they should buy that lens. Obviously not everybody, but it's a great lens. So G Master, top of the line Pro, Sony G and Sony Zeiss Pro. Sony still very good lens. Not as weather sealed. If you're going to be out in the rain, if you're going to be out doing things in the desert, you want that weather sealing. So just think about what you need. If you're only photographing, your kids' soccer games when it's not raining, maybe you don't need that. Then you get into, sometimes there's a lot of things that seem the same. So these are the 51.2, the 51.4, the 51.8, the 52.5, the 52.8, the 51.4, the 55.1.8, the other 51.8, and the other 51.8. And then even more, 51.2 is $2,000. The 51.8 for full frame is $250, but the 51.8 for APS-C is $350. So why are all these different? I'm going to see if I can explain it. So the 51.2, very fast lens. We talked about lens speed. We'll talk about depth of field and all of that again, like I said, in a couple of weeks. So it can be used in the darkest circumstances with the same equivalent, with a faster shutter speed. It has very fast dual linear autofocus motors, so it focuses very, very quickly. It's G Master, so the weather sealing is very good, very, very sharp, excellent coatings. Then you have the 51.4 GM. Many of the same things as the 51.2, just not quite as fast on maximum aperture. You have the 51.8 full frame, which is $250. So the weather sealing and the autofocus isn't going to be as good as the GMs or the Gs because it's a less expensive lens, right? You can't put the motor from a Lamborghini in a Ford Pinto. It's just, they're different things. Nothing, they both serve their purposes. Which one is right for you is whichever one's right for you. The reason that the Sony 51.8 FE is less expensive than the Sony 50mm 1.8 OSS-E is because the OSS, the two APS-C lenses, the silver and the black, the only difference between those two is the one's silver, one's black. The OSS means optical steady shot, and that means that they have image stabilization built into the lens. So if you have a camera with stabilization, they all work together to stabilize. If you have a camera without stabilization, like the 6100, the lens still has stabilization, so you still get some image stabilization if you're shaking or something. Then we have the 52.5G. That's a compact prime, so it's designed in part for things like the A7C, Alpha 7C, Alpha 7C2, Alpha 7CR. It's a very small lens. These sizes are not really consistent with one another, but it's very small. It's a G lens, better weather sealing, very portable. Then you have the 52.8 macro. So macro allows you to get very close to things. So if you want to photograph bugs or very small things, you can focus much closer and they end up much larger in your frame. You have the Sony Planar T-Star 51.4 Zeiss, Sony Zeiss. For a long time, that was Sony's top 50mm lens before the 1.2 and the two GMs came out. So it's Sony with Zeiss, so it's got different coatings. You've got that, then you've got the 55 1.8, oh, which I left the price off of. I don't know what the price is. And then, like I said, the two APS-C 51.8s that have the optical steady shot built in. You can see none of the others say OSS. So the only 50s, hopefully I'm not wrong on this, that have steady shot built in are those two APS-C lenses. But some of that makes sense because on APS-C, 50 millimeters is roughly the equivalent of a 75 millimeter lens. So, and for those who are curious, I have the 55 1.8 and the 50 1.2, and I love them both. Let's talk about lens terminology. So we mentioned a lot of things. Here is the 70 to 200 Sony FE 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 GM OSS 2 lens. Sony, it's a brand, that's easy. FE, like I said, full frame E mount. 70 to 200 is the zoom range, so 70 to 200. F2.8 is the aperture. So if it's only got one aperture, so f2.8 like this, it's a constant aperture as you zoom. Not all lenses have a constant aperture, and we'll go through that. GM is G Master, OSS, optical steady shot, so steady shot built in. It's the second version of this lens, so just to differentiate it from the other lens, it's exactly the same in all ways, except instead of two, it's just nothing. And then lens, because it's a lens. You might see something like this, the 1635 PZ. PZ is power zoom. So what that means is it's mostly useful for video. It has a switch, or if you're using the Sony remote, you can throw the switch and it will automatically zoom in and out. That's great for video so that you have a consistent zoom speed. And then G, it's not a GM, it's a G, still a professional level lens, just not quite to the same standards. I mentioned that you might have a variable aperture on a zoom. So this 200 to 600 is a 5.6 to 6.3. So at 200 millimeters, it's f5.6. At 600 millimeters, it's 6.3. That's not a huge difference. But you'll notice the 200 to 600 is cheaper than the 70 to 200. Part of that is because it's a G, not a GM. It doesn't focus as fast. And part of it is because it's not a fixed aperture. And then we have the Sony E 11 millimeter f1.8. It's only E, not FE like the others. So it's not full frame, it's APS-C. You can also do things like buy adapters. If you have old lenses kicking around from your parents, or you just think old lenses look cool because they kind of do, there's probably an adapter for it for your mirrorless camera. I have an old Minolta lens with a tilt shift adapter, so I can tilt and shift the lens with my old Minolta lens. If you have old A-mount lenses, and Sony bought Minolta's camera division, I don't know, 15, 16, 17 years ago, something like that. So Minolta autofocus lenses from 1988, or Sony autofocus lenses that are A-mount from 2010. If you use this adapter, you can still use them on your mirrorless Sony camera. So with all that said, what camera lens should you buy? It still depends. It just depends on what you need. Do you want an interchangeable lens camera? You've got full frame, you've got APS-C. These are the most current versions. Some of these are still available. Like you can still buy an Alpha 7 R4, I believe, and an Alpha 7 III. But Alpha 1, Alpha 9 II, Alpha 7 IV, Alpha 7 R5, Alpha 7 S3, the ZVE1, all full frame. The Z cameras are typically for vlogging. They have a screen that will switch around to the front. If you're going to do a lot of vlogging, you might consider those, or a lot of video, you might consider those. APS-C, there's 6100, 6400, 6700, the ZVE10. Then you have the 1-inch sensor like the ZV-12, the RX107, the RX104, Xperia Pro I. And then what lens should you get? If you're only going to buy one lens, I would suggest a mid-range zoom as your first lens. You can always buy more lenses later, but just doing a quick search on B&H for mid-range lenses, you've got a range. I particularly like the 20 to 70 f4 and the 24-105 f4 as a starter lens. And then on APS-C, you've got a range. There's a lot of options out there. All right. Every time I do this, I add more information because I just keep thinking of more things that I think would be useful to know. Let's see if there are any questions.
Let's open it up for questions. You do. I was going to say, Tony, it feels like every time there's more information. Like you,
I keep
felt like
thinking
this
of
was
more.
little...
Yeah, there is. I change them every time. It's not the same
What's
deck.
it's not, and that's what I love is why we have to keep rehashing this a couple times a year, is because things do change and it's not just the same old presentation. What do you find, Tony, in talking to beginner photographers? What is the big question nowadays, or the hump that people need to get over as far as gear is concerned for beginners? I feel like this conversation changes every couple of years as well.
I mean, it really just depends on what they want to do. It's hard for people to decide on a camera. And of course, budget comes into play. If we were all made of money, then you just buy 3 cameras and you have one for every purpose. But most of us aren't made of money. I'm not. You may be.
I'm definitely not. I know.
So,
It would be
yeah,
nice to have like a point and shoot and then like a little light mirrorless and then maybe a heavier setup.
yeah, I guess I do have that, but that's because I've been shooting a long time, not because I've made of money.
You pieced it together over time.
Yes.
Yeah, which is
Yeah.
that's the smart thing to do.
Yeah.
It's like, you have I'm guessing you have a travel or your everyday camera that you bring when you're like, okay, I'm not going to bring out for a lot of professional photographers, they have their work setup. The work setup, then they have their like their good camera, but it's not for work. Is this making sense?
Yeah. Well, that's partly why I'm excited about the Alpha 7CR, because it's still 61 megapixels, but it's compact. And so it's just a walking around New York City camera. Pretty nice.
It dances that line perfectly. When I did see that come out, that's exactly what I thought. I'm like, somebody was listening to the people who are like, I don't want a phone. I don't want a bridge camera. I don't want a point and shoot, but I don't want to carry around an Alpha 1 with a G Master.
And sometimes I do that, but it's also when I'm traveling, we have a almost 17-month-old daughter now. So sometimes I'm juggling her too. And so in the past, I might have carried a backpack with 2 bodies and like 5 lenses. Now I'm carrying a diaper bag. So I can't carry as much. And that's where something like the Alpha 7CR is really, really useful.
This is where you learn to reappreciate the zoom lens. It's like everybody gets a kit lens, or they either get a kit lens or you're like, okay, you know what? I'm going to get the professional version of a kit lens, which is usually like a 24-70, 2.8 or something similar. And then you hit a point in your career where you're like, okay, I love primes and I only use primes and I know what I shoot. I don't need that range anymore. And then you become a parent and it's like, you know what? I got room for 1 lens, because you probably carry wipes with you all the time.
Wipes,
depending on how old, you got to have some
snacks.
You can't crush the snacks either. The snacks you got to have insulation. So I can't tell you how many times I've crushed a bag of chips between 2 heavy lenses. And I'm like, if I would have just left the 1 lens, the chips would have been fine.
Yep.
I digress. The life of a parent photographer. It's not easy.
I'm sure it's just us though.
Yeah, it's only just us. I'm sure these aren't problems that are across the board. Well, Tony, thank you also for the clarification. I forgot we added 2 parts to this. So this is now expanded into a 6-part series. We will get
soon it'll be 40 parts.
We might just keep it, just ongoing.
Just 1 a week forever.
There we go. Infinity series coming next year. Tony, always great to have you back on. It's always great to host you. I feel like every time you're scheduled, I'm somewhere running around. So we're going to put an end to that. I've been,
feeling a little neglected, so I appreciate that.
There, I turned it on. I'm like, let me get the colors. Let me come vibrant today for Tony on this gloomy Monday.
It's almost Sony's Cinnabar. So
there you go. I was thinking. Well, Tony, great to have you on. A huge thank you to the entire team at Sony as well for hosting this, and to all of our viewers out there. Can't do it without you. We do it for all of you. No questions today. That means Tony did his job. If you guys are watching this on the replay, feel free to watch it as much as you want over on YouTube at B&H Event Space on YouTube. But we will catch you guys next time for part 2. Alas, that's all we got for you today. Another round of the B&H Virtual Event Space in the books. Catch y'all next time.
Thanks, everybody.